Hello, everybody. Jason from MisprintedMTG.com, and welcome to the third episode of Misprint Masterclass, where we take an in-depth look into the different types of misprints that are out there. Today's episode are going to be about color and ink errors. Rather than look at physical examples of cards like we've done in the previous episodes, I'm first going to talk about how color works in offset lithographic printing, because in order to really understand color errors, you need to understand how they work in printing. And in the next episode, I'll actually show physical examples of cards and talk about what we've talked about in this episode, so we have a good foundation to kind of go off of. So in offset lithographic printing, you know that there are four colors. There's cyan, magenta, and yellow, and black. But we'll get into black in a little bit. The inks that are used are translucent, which means that you could see through them. And when they mix, you get different colors, obviously. When magenta and cyan mix, you kind of get this blue tone. When cyan and yellow mix, you get a green tone. And when yellow and magenta mix, you get a red tone. Based off of how much of each of these colors are used, you get different amounts of different types of colors. So you'll notice that as I reduce the opacity of this cyan layer, the mixing that happens here is different. So it goes from a light green between cyan and yellow to a darker green, and this blue purplish indigo color here becomes purple as I reduce the cyan opacity. And the same thing happens with magenta and yellow. Notice how it goes from a red to an orange to a yellow, to like a deepish yellow. And the same thing happens with the yellow. Now, something really interesting happens when all three mix. Notice here in the center, you kind of have this grayish black. This is referred to as simple black. This is not a true black. A true black, a rich black, is added as its own layer. And this is when the fourth color comes in. Now, let's take a look at what happens when rich black is used to shade the other hues. Real quick, before we go into that, you have three different things that you could do to pure hues. You could tint a hue, which means adding white ink to it. You could shade a hue, which means adding black to it. Or you could tone it, which means adding gray to it. So when we add black, notice what it does to all the colors. Now, it's really convenient that cyan, magenta, and yellow make red, green, and blue, because with the combination of all these colors, you can make pretty much anything that you want. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to hide our rich black. I want you to pay very close attention to simple black here, because that's going to come into effect later. Before we go on to our next Photoshop document, there's one thing I want to talk about. Now, I've been just reducing the opacity of these colors, but that's not actually what's happening in printing. You're not putting down like a 50% cyan. It only prints pure cyan. So how do you get that effect where you can get a 50% cyan or a 0% cyan, or a 100% cyan? That's when something called dot gain comes into effect. You notice here at the top, we have a 10% blue to a 100% blue. And in each of these two columns below, we notice that it's a grid of dots. And based off of the size of that dot, you get different effects as far as the amount of that color that shows. It's an optical illusion. So when you have different sized dots next to each other, you get different intensities of that color. And that's actually what happens when colors mix too. During printing, it's not actually a pure mixing. I mean, sometimes you do have overlapping grid items, but it's actually the proximity of the cyan ink dots to the magenta dots that give you this blue and respectively with all the other colors. So let's take a look at this in practice. Here I've got my Misprinto, and I've actually gone and separated him out into all his different layers. This is something that's done with Magic Art before printing in a process known as raster image processing. They take an existing art and they convert it into all of the dots and all of the individual layers that will be used on the printing plates. So this is the black layer. This is the yellow layer, the magenta layer, and the cyan layer. And you'll notice as I turn these on, the card becomes what it's supposed to look like. So remember how I told you to keep in mind that dullish gray black? You'll notice that when I turn off the black layer, the rich black layer, we get gray borders and we lose a lot of that kind of saturation and deepness that happens in all of our other colors that you get by shading with black. This may look really familiar in cards that you have seen in misprints, so just kind of memorize what this looks like, and when you see your simple black be prominent in places where there should be black, you know that the rich black layer is deficient. This is kind of what happens when you take away the yellow layer. You'll notice that kind of this greenish color here becomes more of a blue because yellow and green make blue, and you lose some of the depth in your other tones. When you take away your magenta, your cyan expresses a lot more, and things actually kind of become a little more of a greenish blue because your yellow and cyan layers are the ones that are showing, and yellow and cyan make green. So that's what happens when you remove magenta. And when you remove cyan, you kind of get this orangey purplish color because, again, yellow and magenta make red. So without the cyan to balance that out into its deeper tones, this is what you end up getting. So let's go ahead and turn off multiple layers. This is without black, without yellow. This is without magenta, without black. This is without cyan, without black. And there are a whole bunch of different color combinations that we can go through. And I'm not going to go through them all because actually what I've got for you is if you go to misprintedmtg.com and scroll down to the layer variations article, I've actually gone and done this with the front and back of Magic cards. Ideally, I would have this for each frame color, but that was a whole lot of work and I haven't done it yet. So for now, it's just a red card and Magic backs. But if you mouse over each of these, it'll tell you exactly what's missing. Now, when you use this, it doesn't have to be just for cards that have a full layer missing. This could be used for blotches, splotches, hickeys. All you have to do is compare the color that you're seeing here to the color of your blotch and splotch, and you'll know what layers are being affected. So this is a really useful tool, so you don't have to memorize color theory and exactly how colors mix and what happens when you have one or multiple channels missing. You could just go here to this article on the website and compare your card to what you got. There's one last thing that I want to show that I forgot to cover when I first recorded the video, and that's what happens when one of these layers gets out of alignment. So let's take our black layer and let's just move it over a bit. Does that look familiar? Notice that when we zoom in, we get that kind of ghosting. You have your rich black layer and your simple black. That's not always the case. Sometimes the mana symbols are not in a simple black, but that's how registration errors look and how they happen when one of those layers gets misaligned. We could do the same with our yellow layer, or try to do the same with our yellow layer. A little less visible. And to misregister our magenta layer. Usually with magenta misregisters or other color misregisters, it's easiest to see it when it's in the knockout. And what I mean by knockout are things that are white. Those are areas that have no printed ink. So when you have a misregistered layer, ink will jump into those respective layers and it's easier to see it, or spots on the card. And let's just push our cyan layer out of registration. So not only do things miss, but sometimes they don't go in the right spot. So that's going to wrap it up for this episode. In the next episode, we'll take a look at physical examples and what they look like and talk about what we've learned. So thanks for tuning in. This is Jason from misprintedmtg.com. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next episode.